Hello everyone, welcome back to The Bunker. I'm Captain Logan. Today I'm going to tell you how I felt about The Interview. No, not the Seth Rogen comedy about the dictator of North Korea, that really controversial movie. I'm sure everybody's really disappointed that that's not what I'm talking about, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about a movie that came out in 1998 that I had never heard of, once again called The Interview, with Hugo Weaving. It's kind of an intimate, mostly closed room drama. It's a psychological thriller that's all about the bureaucracy and politics involved in a police department trying to bring a serial killer to justice, and specifically dealing just with the interrogation process. And I like that this movie is called The Interview and not The Interrogation, because of course it is an interrogation, but the fact that we use a more benign word like interview instead of interrogation tells you a lot, and that's a lot of what this movie is about. How we actually are treating people that we think might be the suspect that we're looking for versus how it's supposed to be perceived in the public. How are we actually walking the letter of the law versus what our reputation is in the public, and whether or not the people who are trying to bring criminals to justice are more interested in their reputation and the reputation of the department at large, and whether they're actually interested in justice. And Hugo Weaving gives a absolutely fantastic and layered and fascinating performance in this. It watches almost like it's in real time. I mean, it's not, but like, this is a pretty short movie. This is like an hour and a half movie, I think, and it's I think only about 5 or 6 hours pass, and about halfway through I was like, oh, he's only been in that room for 4 or 5 hours. So it feels almost like it's real time. Very little, there's very little that happens that we don't see. And I say psychological thriller. This is not an action movie. There's no action whatsoever in this film. There's no car chase. We don't actually see any murders take place, even though that does happen, or is the background at least of this movie. It's very talky, and it could be a stage play, and I wonder if this has ever been adapted to stage. I've not looked into the background of this. I don't know if The Interview is, I should have looked at this, if it's adapted from a play or from a book or anything. But yeah, I could certainly see this on stage, and if I ever had the opportunity, I certainly would go see this on stage. The question you're asking yourself through this entire movie is whether or not Hugo Weaving's character is actually the serial killer, and also who exactly we're supposed to root for. And that kind of changes, as for me anyway, as the movie unfolds. And I don't want to give away too much because I'm absolutely recommending this movie. I certainly am feeling it, and there's very little that I didn't like and appreciate about this movie. But it didn't end up being the same thing that I thought it was at the beginning, and hopefully I'm not giving away too much by saying this, but at first it seemed like it was going to be all about this. And I should have known that we would be questioning this more because it's Hugo Weaving, and he plays a lot of kind of deceptive and despicable characters. But at first, it seems like we have a very innocent, just completely innocent man who is being berated by these interviewers, and it seemed like it was going to be about this department just trying to pin these murders on someone for the sake of their reputation. And as it unfolds, it becomes a lot more complicated than that, and you start thinking, oh, maybe this lead investigator who seemed to be kind of looking for every loophole and really like pushing the letter of the law constantly, maybe he actually knows what he's doing. And there's this wonderful ethical question in this as to whether or not some of the methods he is using are should be acceptable. But then it starts to feel like he's maybe getting the job done, and you start to kind of, I don't want to say root for that character, but sympathize with him, certainly. And my sympathies kept changing throughout this movie. And so it starts out where I'm like, oh, that guy is kind of a scumbag, and look at all these methods he's using that are uncouth. And then I started to turn that around a little bit, and I was like, but he understands the criminal mind, and he thinks that this guy is the killer, and it seems like he might be onto something. And then you start, and then the curtain starts to get pulled back a little bit, and you start to realize that the reason this investigator was brought in the first place is because he is willing to do things that others are not, and that he might play a little bit of dirty pool. And the whole reason the department wanted him in the first place is because he gets results. And then he starts getting in trouble for using the methods that he was brought in for in the first place. And so all of that intrigue with the, again, politics of the department are really interesting. Hugo Weaving's performance, like I said, is absolutely fascinating and spectacular. He plays it almost like he's got multiple personalities. It's not an identity disassociative thing, but he kind of plays it that way. So at the beginning, he's real mousy and he's scared, and he's acting like he doesn't understand why he's there. And of course, I'm innocent. I didn't do anything. He's this man who's just kind of a loser. He's had a run of bad luck, and he's having a hard time putting his life together. And he's kind of this just middle-aged guy with no prospects who is trying to find a job and goes to different towns on the weekends looking for work. And he keeps showing up too late, and he can't, or at least that's what he claims is happening, and then we start to question that as time goes on. And then later on, because one of the tactics that the investigators are using is that they won't give him any food, they're starving him out. And so there's a lot of, psychological manipulation with that, and then there's also a lot of intimidation tactics, and he starts to act like he did it. And he starts to give away a lot of details, and he's acting almost like he's getting off on it. And then later on, he claims that he just did that in order to get fed, and it worked. He gets a meal, and so the whole time you're like, I don't know if this guy is actually the serial killer or not. I could see it going either way. And I've actually watched a number of documentaries and episodes of series about this very subject. I've always found this really interesting, which is part of the reason I checked this out. And also, I suspect part of the reason it was on my recommend list from Netflix, where there are a lot of interrogation tactics that are unreliable that get used anyway, where if an investigator believes that the person is guilty, he'll try to get him to say what he wants to hear, and in the being intimidated and being scared and being freaked out at the prospect of getting put away for life, or being held against your will without being charged for anything, so you feel like the system isn't working, and all of that. A lot of people, and there's a lot of studies that have been done on this, will just do that. They'll start to just say whatever an investigator wants to hear, even if they didn't do it. And there are a lot of there's a whole series on Netflix. I forget what it's called. About, I'm pretty sure it has confessions in the title, about people who confess to crimes that they may or may not have committed. And a lot of those are inconclusive, where by the end you really don't know if the person who was convicted or investigated actually did the thing that they were investigated for or not. But sometimes you find out that the person is completely innocent, and there was so much psychological torture done to them that they finally just gave in and not just admitted to doing a thing they didn't do, but would make up really specific details about it. But the moral of this story isn't that coercion doesn't work so much as it is that it's complicated. It leaves the ethical questions really ambiguous and allows you to make up your own mind, which I really appreciate. Like I said, I really like the subtlety of this movie. I like that it kind of just puts everything on the table and allows you to decide for yourself, and it feels very real. It feels like I'm almost watching a real investigation, and it's uncomfortably real. It hits upon a lot of truths, and so you find yourself questioning, whether or not some of these intimidation tactics might actually sometimes be necessary. Because, like I said, there's research where we find that sometimes they lead people to just say what you want to hear, and yet there are places in this movie where they seem to be also very effective, and that ends up being very believable. And so criminal justice is hard, I guess, is kind of the lesson at the end of this. And I think the movie is coming down mostly on the side of try to be as above board as you possibly can, and maybe it's just a depends issue. Maybe it's just that sometimes the ends maybe seem to justify the means, and it's just a case-by-case thing. It's so difficult to decide the ethics of this, right? Because at the end of the day, it kind of just depends on what the results are. Where if you got a serial killer off the street, you're not going to feel bad that you manipulated him and didn't let him have lunch. But if it turns out that guy is innocent, now you've done a bad thing. So what exactly do you do? But also I think the moral of the story is that the justice should outweigh the reputation of the department, and that sometimes you gotta fall on your sword a little bit in order to do the right thing. But then that gets complicated too, because if people don't trust the police department, then it makes it much more difficult for them to do their jobs. And so I found myself very frustrated watching this movie in a good way, because it was just landing on, like I said, a lot of the realities of criminal justice in a democracy. This very movie, this is an Australian film, this very script could have been easily adapted for an American audience. You have what look like very similar justice systems, and it seems like the rights of prisoners are very much the same. And I don't know a lot about criminal justice in Australia, but the way this plays is very much the way I would expect it to play here. I was a little bit surprised how long it took Hugo Weaving's character to ask for what they call in this movie a solicitor, what we would call a lawyer or a counselor, and they call him a lawyer too, but he's asked for a solicitor. And by the way, I also enjoyed all the Australian terminology that I wasn't used to, but in some places found myself more acclimated and knew what people were talking about more than I would have if I hadn't done this YouTube channel, because we've got a viewer, Magpie's Nest Productions, who has sent me some things from Australia in the past, who asked me a couple of years ago to review a film called Ned Kelly, and there's a Ned Kelly reference in this movie, and I knew what they were talking about, so I felt good about myself. I was like, oh, I know something about Australia. And anyway, but I was surprised by how long it took for him to ask for a lawyer, and that's exactly how you would play that in America. Is the first thing you do is I want legal representation. But then also, there might be reasons for that I don't want to spoil. There are a lot of places in this where I would find myself scratching my head and go, ooh, I don't know if that makes sense. And then 5 or 10 minutes later, a thing would come up that would explain it, and it's just a really logical, smart script. The ending is ambiguous. It's somewhat, well, it's ambiguous about a particular character, but not so much Hugo Weaving's character. I think by the end, we certainly have a good sense of who he is and what he's up to. We don't know the fate, ultimately, of the investigator, because something happens to him and you wonder, where he's going to wind up at the end. And I would have liked to have had that, but at the same time, I think it makes sense that that's left ambiguous, and it's interesting, I guess, to wonder about it. But like, the fate of that guy isn't the point so much as why that ends up happening to him. I'm being cryptic on purpose because I want you guys to watch this if you haven't seen it before. But I also want to comment on the score, which is wonderfully haunting, and I found it really unsettling and unnerving. It's mostly piano music, but then there are, it's this like sickeningly sweet, haunting piano melody that is stuck in my head right now and probably will be for the next week. But there are places where that is underscored by some really creepy string stuff, and I like that a lot. Again, it's a pretty subtle soundtrack, and it just everything about this feels like it could have been made in almost any era. Cinematography is really good, set design is really good. It's a real like bleak and gritty looking movie. The look of the interrogation room and the police department at large is nearly Gothic. You could have seen this shot on the sets of Gotham. It's not as grand as all that, but it feels, I don't know if it's heightened, because this might be what some places like that in Australia look like. It might be what some places here look like. Like it's this foreboding, kind of cold sort of look to make criminals feel uneasy, and that's maybe a little bit heightened, but it's super effective for the sake of this movie. Anyway, like I said, I was really interested in all the bureaucracy and politics and just how complicated everything was. Nobody feels like a two-dimensional character to me. Even the characters who by the end seem more in the wrong, I find myself sympathizing with and understanding why they're doing what they're doing. And I wouldn't call, because you would think that Hugo Weaving's character would be the protagonist in this, that this is about a man who is accused of something that he may or may not have done, and it is about that, but I don't think he, by the end of the day, is actually the protagonist. He's kind of more the central set piece of this, and it's more about the policeman trying to figure out this case that they've been dealing with forever, and that at this point they just want to put to bed. There's also an interesting journalist angle with this that I kind of wish was actually brought more to the forefront and that more was done with. But I appreciate that it's touched on and that like all the major aspects of this are talked about. And it gets a lot done in exploring that idea and doing some social commentary with it in just this like 5, 6, 7 hours in an afternoon where all this takes place. It's a really excellent occasion for story and breaking status quo, and it's certainly a story beginning, middle to end. It's not just kind of spinning its wheels and playing with this idea. It is certainly a traditional narrative, and it's excellent. It's kind of a short story brought to screen is how it watches, and I highly recommend it. So once again, I'm feeling it. Thanks a lot for watching. Sure appreciate it, and I'll see you again with another review in the not too distant future. I'm Captain Logan, and I'll see you again next time.